Let us bow in prayer together. Heavenly Father, we have sung some very wonderful words. We have declared that our fear doesn't stand a chance when we stand in your love. We hope, Lord, and pray that the confessions that have proceeded from our mouth reside deep within our hearts and minds, and that we truly believe what we have just sung. We ask, O Lord, that as we now open your word and we study it together, that once again we would be amazed at the way you work. In many regards, Lord, though we know you through Christ, you still remain a mystery to us. For we are confounded in the ways that you often work and the people you often work through. Help us, O Lord, to grasp the full disclosure of your grace. To understand, O Lord, that no one is deserving of your salvation, and yet you freely give it. And that no one deserves the honor of serving you, yet you call us to this great service. So help us, O Lord, to read this word, to let it speak to us, and then give us the grace to live it out. For it's in the name of Jesus we now offer this prayer. Amen. For about 6 months on Wednesday nights, we have been studying 1 Kings on Wednesday night. And so some of you are well aware of the historical nature of that document. And in actuality, we'll be studying from 2 Kings today. And we need to remind ourselves that 1 and 2 Kings, like 1 and 2 Chronicles, are historical accounts of what was taking place in the nations of Israel and Judah at a particular time in those nations' history. Now, the history was written much later in time, but they were compiled from records that the historians had uncovered, much like today. When we write a history of, say, the Revolutionary War, we've just celebrated our Independence Day, our 4th of July. And, we sometimes forget some of the things about that, like the fact that John Adams never really celebrated the 4th of July. Did you know that? Because he had told his wife Abigail that July the 2nd would be just marked on the nation's mind, forever, because he thought that was the day that should be celebrated. I don't know why, but he did. So it is with us that sometimes our histories are challenging. Sometimes they call us to study and remind ourselves who we are and what we are. So we're in 2 Kings chapter 5, and we're going to read verses 1 through 19a. 1 through 19a. Now Naaman was commander of the great army of the king of Aram. He was a great man in the sight of his master and highly regarded, because through him the Lord had given victory to Aram. He was a valiant soldier, but he had leprosy. Now bands from Aram had gone out and had taken captive a young girl from Israel, and she served Naaman's wife. She said to her mistress, "If only my master would see the prophet who is in Samaria, he would cure him of his leprosy." Naaman went to his master and told him what the girl from Israel had said. "By all means go," the king of Aram replied. "I will send a letter to the king of Israel." So Naaman left, taking with him 10 talents of silver, 6,000 shekels of gold, and 10 sets of clothing. The letter that he took to the king of Israel said, "With this letter I am sending my servant Naaman to you, so that you may cure him of his leprosy." As soon as the king of Israel read the letter, he tore his robes and said, "Am I God? Can I kill and bring back to life? Why does this fellow send someone to me to be cured of his leprosy? See how he is trying to pick a quarrel with me?" When Elisha, the man of God, heard that the king of Israel had torn his robes, he sent him this message: "Why have you torn your robes? Have the man come to me, and he will know that there is a prophet in Israel." So Naaman went with his horses and chariots and stopped at the door of Elisha's house. Elisha sent a messenger to say to him, "Go wash yourself 7 times in the Jordan, and your flesh will be restored, and you will be cleansed." But Naaman went away angry and said, "I thought that he would surely come out to me and stand and call on the name of the Lord his God, wave his hand over the spot and cure me of my leprosy. Are not Abana and Pharpar, the rivers of Damascus, better than any of the waters of Israel? Could not wash in them and be cleansed?" So he turned and went off in a rage. Naaman's servants went to him and said, "My father, if the prophet had told you to do some great thing, would you not have done it? How much more then when he tells you, 'Wash and be cleansed'?" So he went down and dipped himself in the Jordan 7 times, as the man of God had told him, and his flesh was restored and became clean like that of a young boy. Then Naaman and all his attendants went back to the man of God. He stood before him and said, "Now I know that there is no God in all the world except in Israel. Please accept now a gift from your servant." The prophet answered, "As surely as the Lord lives, whom I serve, I will not accept a thing." And even though Naaman urged him, he refused. "If you will not," said Naaman, "please let me, your servant, be given as much earth as a pair of mules can carry, for your servant will never again make burnt offerings and sacrifices to any other god but the Lord. But may the Lord forgive your servant for this one thing. When my master enters the temple of Rimmon to bow down, and he is leaning on my arm, and I bow down there also. When I bow down in the temple of Rimmon, may the Lord forgive your servant for this." "Go in peace," Elijah said. I know the text for today was rather long, but I hope you agree with me. We're only halfway through. There's more to the story, but I hope you agree with me that to this point, this is one of the most interesting short stories you've ever read. And reality is, whoever penned it is a master of telling stories, because it is so complex. It is filled with so many things that work against one another, and yet it is so simple as well. And in a very short span of words, this great writer tells us much about the people involved in the story. Like take Naaman, for instance. Did you grasp how quickly we learned so much information about this person? Like the fact that he is a great commander of the armies of Aram. That is modern-day Syria. And if you haven't read the Bible, if you haven't caught on to even modern history, you know Syria is one of those countries that tends to be at war with Israel. And he's this great commander. And that doesn't surprise us. And it doesn't surprise us that he's gained favor with his king as well. Because anytime we have great warriors, anytime we have soldiers who do wonderful things, we like to honor them. We like to celebrate their achievements. Even in this country, we do such a thing. Especially in the early days of our nation, and even up through the middle of the last century. It wasn't unusual for our generals to become our presidents. Who was our first president? Wasn't it Washington? After the Civil War, who became president? Wasn't it Grant? And even in the 1950s, who was it that became president? Wasn't it Eisenhower? Maybe some of you are old enough to remember that old television series, Happy Days. Do you remember that? Yeah, some of you are smiling. That means you're old like me. Anyway, there's this episode in Happy Days where it is focusing on the election where Eisenhower is running for president. And it's interesting that one of the great proponents of Eisenhower was none other than that great, wonderful character in Happy Days, the Fonz. And he says, everyone likes Ike, even my bike likes Ike. Hey. Right? And so we can understand this. Our heroes who lead us to victory, we celebrate. But how about the heroes of other countries who bring us defeat? Can you imagine us today, just after July the 4th, celebrating someone who has caused us harm, someone who has defeated our soldiers, someone who has defeated our armies? Can we even begin to grasp what would be the equivalent today of what this historian is writing then? No. It's hard for us as Americans to even think such things. And yet here in the text. Sort of surprising, isn't it? It's even more surprising what this historian adds with that. He says this Naaman, this pagan soldier, was used of God. Used of God. Used of God to bring punishment to God's people. That's a kind of frightening thing to think about. Ponder it for a second and see if it doesn't send a shiver up your spine. If God's people wander off and quit worshiping God, what might God do? What might He do? In an act of love. You see, sometimes God calls His people back to Himself in very, very unusual ways. We sometimes forget that God can use whomever God wants to use. He can even use a powerful pagan by the name of Naaman. Now here we come to another surprising thing. We often think the powerful have it made. We look at them in their palaces and, driving their powerful cars, or in this case, chariots. And we wish we could be like them. And yet the text clearly tells us that this man, Naaman, has a problem. His problem is leprosy. The word that is used there in the Hebrew, and then that is translated over into the Greek in the Septuagint, basically, it doesn't refer to what we think of as leprosy today. Maybe you've seen pictures or if you've seen movies where people were leprous and they had their limbs fall off, and it's a very critical condition. The word that is used here could be used of almost any skin disease that we may face today. One of the things that many folks have is psoriatic arthritis. So, if you battle psoriasis in any form or any fashion, this may be what he had. And the interesting thing that you need to realize is just like those commercials on TV that show these things that can help that inflammation of the skin, in that day, this very ailment, if it was able to be seen, would make you almost socially an outcast. And this is, for instance, what is taking place in many cases in the Bible, that these are the maladies that the folks have. And it's interesting that that word that is used here can actually even be used for mold in someone's home. That's disastrous, isn't it? Mold in your home, you don't want that either. So it's really hard for us to know exactly what it is that Naaman has. The only thing we know is that it's causing him problems. Maybe he's self-conscious about it. Maybe he thinks people are looking at me. And if you want to find somebody who really becomes insecure about something, find someone who is powerful that has an affliction. And watch how they behave. Again, we're surprised to find the person God uses. Did you notice that? Another surprising, there is this young girl, and the Arameans raid Israel, and when they do, they capture her. They bring her back, and she becomes a servant, a slave, in the household of Naaman. She becomes especially the servant of Naaman's wife, who goes unnamed. Actually, the slave goes unnamed. So many times the heroes or heroines in the Bible remain nameless. Have you ever noticed that? On many occasions. We know the names of very few people, actually, and this is the case here. And it's interesting that this is the person, this slave in the household of Naaman, who shares good news with her mistress, who then shares this good news with her husband. It's unbelievable. Think about that for a second. God using this slave girl in this way. It boggles the mind. And the interesting thing about this is that this is a young girl whose faith seems to be so mature. I don't know, how many of us, if we were a slave, think of it just for a second, slave in the household of someone, would we find ourselves wishing good for that person? What kind of faith is that? What kind of faith is it that someone who is being mistreated, maybe, I don't know, maybe he treated well, I don't know, but someone who is not free suddenly says, I want my master to be free of this disease. What kind of mature faith is that? I wish I had that kind of faith. You know where I've seen that kind of faith? Several weeks ago, some of us went to Poplar Forest, Jefferson's home in Bethel. And some of you have been there. If you've been there, you see many wonderful things. It reminds us of really the brilliance of the man. I mean, just the way his kitchen was set up and his grounds were set up and everything was set up. And, it was just really interesting to see. And so you got to see all these things that Jefferson accomplished, from the architecture to whatever, right? But you know what I found to be the most fascinating thing in all of that place? It was a simple letter that was written in 1818 by a slave woman named Hannah. And Jefferson had given her control of Poplar Forest while he was away. And so she was writing him a letter. She's literate. She's writing him a letter to tell him of how things are going at Poplar Forest. And while she's telling him of what is going on at Poplar Forest and the reason it's being run so well, you can well imagine who is, causing that to happen. Hannah herself. She doesn't brag at all, though. While they're going well, she also says that she prays for his health. She prays for his health. But if you go on and you read that letter as well, what you discover in it is a clear confession of the woman's faith. She is a devout Christian. Now, this is what surprises us many times, is how God calls the powerless, the so-called powerless, to point the powerful to himself. Great. I told you this is a complex story. It's beautiful in its simplicity. You know, I sometimes wonder if what would happen in our country today if people of faith would act like that unnamed slave girl, or they would act like, well, the prophet that we'll soon discover, you know, or if they would act like that Hannah, that slave, Thomas Jefferson's wife. I wonder if the people of faith, the people who follow Jesus today, would say to our political figures, hey, you know, you're struggling. What we'll do is provide you with some solutions. You know, the king said, who am I? Who am I to bring healing to this person? You know, the powerful is now powerless. And if you don't think the powerful can be powerless, then let me ask you something. What's your view of health care in this country? The powerful can become powerless because they disagree on everything. Right? And while our politicians are struggling to decide how in the world we should approach this national issue, we discover that there are churches in this country who actually have decided to pay the medical bills for quite a few people. I heard of a couple of churches that have paid millions of dollars of health bills for people. You see, we come to government and we say, you provide us with the solutions, and government looks back at us and many times says we don't have solutions, and yet God has given us the solutions and we fail to act on them. We may be surprised at how simple things are really from time to time, like how simple it was for Naaman. But it's hard for him as well. Did you notice here the girl tells him to go, to Israel to see the prophet. You know, if he just goes, he'll be healed. He goes to his king, who sends him to Israel's king, who then is informed. Finally, we learn his name by Elisha to send him to me. And things will be okay. Don't tear your clothes. You didn't need to tear your clothes, king. You didn't need to fret. You didn't need to do anything. You send them to me. And this guy, this powerful person will discover there is a prophet in Israel. And so he sends them to Elisha. And he comes, and instead of going to the door himself, Elisha sends one of his servants to the door and tells this great powerful person, this Naaman, he says, go dip in the Jordan River 7 times and you'll be cleansed. And of course, here all of a sudden you find, he doesn't even come out. One thing, it's an affront to Naaman that Elisha didn't come out himself. Secondly, he said it was his expectation that when he got to the front door of Elisha the prophet, that Elisha would come out and he'd go, you're healed! And he would be healed, right? In the name of his God. And secondly, he says, you know what? What is this river in Israel compared to the rivers I have back home in Syria that are much more pure, much more clean, much more beautiful than this little trickling thing right here? Right? And so you see what he's struggling with there. He's struggling with two things, especially. He's struggling with his expectations and he's struggling with his pride. And these are the things you and I struggle with as well. We expect God to do it, everything in the way that we want God to do it in. And when God doesn't do that way, we go away and pout, just like Naaman does. And yet here is the offer. And all of a sudden, again, these people who are servants say to their master, hey, if Elisha had told you to do some great thing, you would have done it just to get rid of this leprosy. And after he thought about it for a little while, after he had cooled off a little bit, and it's always good to have a little time instead of, it's a wonder he didn't try to kill, Elisha, but instead he went off and he cooled down. And after he cooled down and he thought about it, he says, that's really not a big deal. I'm going to go do it. Already an act of faith, right? Already an act of faith. You don't go bathe in the Jordan 7 times. You don't go dip in the Jordan 7 times unless you believe maybe the guy knows what he's talking about. So he goes and he dips in the Jordan 7 times, and what happens? He's cleansed. He's cleansed. It's an amazing thing the way the Bible uses words and everything, because the word that is used for cleanse there also means that he has experienced ritual purity. Remember also in that day, if someone had some type of disease like leprosy, whatever it was, that person would be, unable really not just socialize with other people, but would not be able to perform some of the religious rites of their religious faith. So it is saying here that this Naaman is clean through and through. Through and through. So what does he do? He's been cleansed. Maybe we're surprised that he converts. He converts. Here's this man. He's the general in the army of Syria. And he comes and he's cleansed. And he then tells the prophet Elijah, hey, listen, from now on, I'm not going to offer sacrifices to anyone, any God but the Lord who is God. And did you notice how clear of a confession he makes? Look, listen once again to Naaman's words. Now I know that there is no God in all the world except in Israel. Now I want to tell you something today. We try to be very politically correct when we make our confessions. We say, what do we say? Well, you can believe anything you believe as long as you believe something, right? This is not what Naaman's saying at all. Naaman's saying, well, every other God that people are worshiping, they're not God at all. There's only one God, and this is the God in Israel. And it reminds us of another confession made by a pagan soldier. You know where that takes place? It takes place at the end of Mark's Gospel, towards the end of Mark's Gospel. You know what's happening then? Well, there is one Jesus, and he's being crucified, and he comes to his death, and he utters his cry, and when this Roman centurion looks up and he sees the way that he dies, and the confession he makes, the profession he makes, all of a sudden he says, surely this man was the Son of God. It's funny that pagans will say things that Christians will not. Naaman's conversion is surprising to us, but it's not to be doubted. I think it's interesting as we look at his confession, we see that it is more than a statement of belief. It is a giving of life, of the totality of one's being. It is a knowing that makes this person question things about himself and the way he is to live. Did you notice the questions that Naaman asked following his declaration that now I know that there is no God in all the world except in Israel? All of a sudden he's asking many things. The first thing he does, he asks the prophet, hey, listen, can I give you something for my healing? Can I give you something for my healing? And this reminds us that anytime someone is experiencing something, a gift from God, the first thing that should be expressed is gratitude. And the only thing that causes us to be filled with gratitude is to come to the point in our life when we understand that what we have been given, we have not deserved. You see, as long as we believe that what we have been given, we've deserved all along, we won't see it as grace. But when we understand what grace has been given to us, then the only response we can have towards grace is gratitude. That's what he said. He said, hey, what in the world can I give? What in the world can I give you in response to what has been given to me? Did you notice the second thing he said? He asked for something. He says, can you give me enough salt from this place that 2 donkeys can carry? Because, you see, that's what he wants to take back. In other words, this man knows something. He knows that the response to grace is gratitude, and he knows that the response to God should always be worship. And so they still have this idea in this text, or at that time, that somehow the God was somehow tied to a particular place, a particular soul. And so he says, you know what? Even though I'm going back to Syria, even though I'm going back there, back home, I'm not going back the same. And when I get back there, I'm going to worship God. I'm going to worship God. I'm going to take this soul back with me. And where I plant that soul, I am going to worship God. So you see what he says? 2 things. Very powerful here. Very powerful. And then he says something else that reveals his faith. He understands something that you and I need to remember from time to time. That what we say we believe should impact the way we behave. In other words, there is no such thing as a religious life and a secular life. Okay? We divide the two, don't we? We divide. Well, on Sunday morning, I go to church. And that's my Christianity. I go to church, that's my Sabbath, I go to church, and that's what's taking place, and I'm going there, But this man knows that it's something more. He says, you know what? Elisha, please grant me this. I'm not going to worship any other God but the Lord of Israel. But when I go back, and my master requires me to go, remember he was probably serving almost as a bodyguard for him too. When my master goes to the temple of Rimmon, the god of Syria, he says, when he bows, and he's got me, next to him, and he's got my arm, right? He says, and I am forced to bow with him. Please don't hold this against me. In other words, he's saying, as I carry out my duties, as a soldier for my king, I know that it's going to be a struggle with my faith. Same for you, same for me, right? Yeah, it is a struggle. It is a struggle. One of the things I am grateful for is, now don't take this wrong, that I did not go into ministry right out of like college. I didn't go to seminary right out of college. I worked at a bank for 12 and a half years before I ever did this very thing. Because I know what it's like out there in the world. I've been there. I've seen what takes place. And I know the tension that can be created when you're trying to live out your faith in a world that seems to be devoid of faith. Such a simple story. Now, this is what I find amazing about this story. A couple of things. One is that we seldom want healing for our enemies. It's interesting that Elisha must grant Naaman his request because he says, go in peace. Go in peace. Go in peace. Think of that for a second. Go in shalom, wholeness, be well. I think of that, we just have July the 4th, so they have all those, war, movies on and everything. And I saw the Hacksaw Ridge again, and Desmond Doss. That whole story just fascinates me and everything. But there's one particular scene that really grips me. His bravery, of course, he won 2 Bronze Stars before he got to Hacksaw Ridge for bravery. And he was wounded like 4 times, there. I think his arm was broken, his finger something was broken because of whatever, by a bullet, a sniper's bullet. But the scene that really gets me in that whole movie is where Desmond Doss is hiding in those concrete bunkers that the Japanese have created for protection. He's hiding from the Japanese, and he's running around. He's trying to escape all these Japanese soldiers who are going through those tunnels and everything. And as he takes a corner, he runs into a wounded Japanese soldier. And you would think he would grab him, choke him, and kill him. And he says, shh. And then he takes out some gauze, and he places it on the man's wound. And he has him hold that gauze to stop the blood flow. And then he takes out a morphine pin and sticks him with it to ease his pain. Powerful. How in the world do you do such a thing? I mean, how do you give aid to the enemy? What causes people to do so? It is amazing who God sends to us and who God sends us to. And He calls us to do something good, often in a world that is so bad. Think about that. What is God calling us to? I've got 2 brother-in-laws. 2 brother-in-laws. Well, actually I have 3, I guess. I forget, one by marriage, Bruce brother. But I've got 2 brother-in-laws, two men who are married to my sisters. Okay, that's the easiest way. I've got 2 men who are married to my sisters, okay? And I love them both. I know that's unusual. I know it's unusual. They are great guys, great guys. One of them is named Tony. Tony was raised a Catholic, but he came to the Lord in prison in California. And now Tony and my sister Pam, they have a ministry. They go to a nursing home in my hometown where they share Christ through song and word with the people there. My other brother-in-law is Roger, and Roger was a fireman, professional fireman. He actually got paid for putting out fires, and he retired, but he actually still works for the Roanoke City Fire Department from time to time. But anyway, we were up in Roanoke on July the 4th. We took my mom out to eat, and then we went back by Tony's and my sister Pam, and we talked, and Pam wanted me to look through some old pictures and everything of my dad and our family and take what I wanted, and I took quite a few. But anyway, while we were talking, Tony told me that we were talking about religious matters, and Tony said that, so-and-so is now a Christian. I said, "What? You gotta be kidding." I said, "How in the world did that happen?" He said, "Roger." I said, "What?" He said, "Yeah, God's using Roger as really a great evangelist. Not in the bad sense where you can get in that sense, but in the sense of going and just sharing his faith with people." He said, "Yeah, this guy's in the hospital, he's terminally ill." And so Roger goes to see him. And while he's talking with him, and the guy's in the hospital and he's terminally ill because of the lifestyle he has lived. He drank, and he did drugs. And Roger went to visit him. And the young man did many other things beside that. And he said to Roger was sharing his faith. And the guy looked at him and said, "Roger, you don't know what I've done in my life." And Roger looked at him and said, called his name and said, "You don't know what I've done." And Roger told Tony that then and there that this man, who's still a relatively young man, made a profession of faith. Now, there are folks probably who know that young man who say he's still a pagan. He's still a pagan. Tony says that Roger says this man who has lived such a hard life is now a Christian. What do you think? What do you think? Can it really be that simple? Let us pray. Heavenly Father, help us to remember your grace. It's grace that reaches out to the greatest sinner. And it's grace that turns the greatest sinner into your servant. Help us, O Lord, to grasp the wonder of this grace so that we can experience the cleansing that you want us to know. And then so we can share the gift that you want us to extend towards others. Help us, O Lord, to be faithful in following Jesus, in whose name we pray. Amen. So, what about you? I tend to think that you fall into one of two groups here today. Now, maybe you're not totally like that young man in the hospital in hometown of Roanoke. But you would say something to me like what he said to my brother-in-law. But you don't know what I've done with my life. You don't know what I've done with my life. But what are you going to do with your life now? If you could feel God's cleansing, if you could feel not just physically whole, but spiritually well, why wouldn't you believe and accept God's goodness? And then there are some of us here where we remember who we are, and maybe that holds us back, and we wonder how in the world God can use us. And yet, here in the story, we are told of God using many people. I cannot help but believe that once Naaman headed back home, and once he arrived in Syria, that God continued to use him there. What do you think? What do you think? And so, I'm going to ask Josh to come forward and stand up here and ask yourself these questions. How should I respond to God's invitation this morning? What is God calling me to right now? And then do like Naaman. Take it in. Please stand.